Hello, product people. Welcome to the Product for Product podcast, hosted by Matt Green, data advocate and product manager, and Masha Mikanovsky, product leader and author. Our goal is to serve the product community by helping you find products that can help make your work in product management easier. Thanks for joining us on another episode of the Product for Product podcast.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about the NoCode platform Bubble. We're happy to have Kishan Hansjee on the show to learn about Bubble and how he's using the tool. How you doing, Kishan?
Hey, Matt. I'm good. Thanks. How are you?
Doing wonderful. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Kishan. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Masha.
And you're joining us from South Africa, I believe, right?
Yeah, that's right. Johannesburg, South Africa.
Perfect. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. So my background is in marketing. I started out as a web developer and then branched more into the consulting side of marketing, covering like CRM implementation and sales and service software as well. Nowadays, I'm more in an entrepreneurial role. I have started my own business, which is a lead generation software. And I do a lot of experimentation with new ideas and rapid prototyping.
Nice. So that's how you got into NoCode. And, we were talking in our previous episode, Matt and I, about we might not find traditional product managers that are using NoCode. So tell us a bit more about how you got to it and how you got to Bubble.
Sure. So I was really looking for something that I could create a very, very quick prototype for. Just create an MVP that I could get some users to test the product, to get some quick feedback, and to kind of follow an iterative process that wasn't the usual process of going from wireframing to designing a UI to building something, getting feedback, and then re-looping that through. And that's how I discovered Bubble. And I found it cut out a lot of the steps in the traditional process that I used and allowed me to really create something that was very, very agile, and I could make changes, create A/B tests very easily, and get really solid user feedback on an MVP.
Mm-hmm. So can you give us some examples of type of products that you built?
Yeah. So the first one I built was a recruitment software, funnily enough. And it was a software that allowed a recruiter or an HR manager at a business to create a job listing and then to accept applications to that job listing. And what it really did, as opposed to the usual job board, is it structured the data in a way that really allowed the HR manager to get ratings of the people who applied and be able to search from the highest rated applicant by fit to the lowest, so they could easily go through the screening process. And it did that by using a few external data sources, but also reading certain data from the user's browser that they used. So if it was a remote position, we could detect things like the internet speed. If it was a position that was in person and in office position, we could use geolocation to find the applicant's location with their consent and look at things like traffic patterns between the applicant and the business, and look at things like, would this factor into how long they would stay at the company? Would they be losing a lot of time in their day traveling back and forth to the office? And looking at more of the softer side of recruitment and seeing what are the other factors besides just skill set are in not just an applicant's fit for the position, but their fit as a long-term employee of a company.
Mm-hmm. So were you able to build all of that with Bubble?
Yeah, we were able to build that with Bubble and with a bit of custom code as well. So Bubble does let you create your own plugins. So there was 1 or 2 bits of custom code, but the majority of it was built directly in Bubble.
Wow, that's cool. That sounds like a robust product.
Yeah, it's really great because there's a lot of out-of-the-box functionality with Bubble, things like allowing users to register. You can even send out verification emails built in with Bubble. So when somebody registers, it verifies their email address by sending them a mail. They activate their account. So you can avoid spam and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it was really, really good. The data set is easy to set up. the database is very, very intuitive to build out a data structure. So yeah, we managed to get quite a lot of that functionality built directly with Bubble.
So if the audience is someone that doesn't have a development background, how do you feel they would be able to get along in Bubble? Would they understand what the database is, what the database structure is, and all of that stuff?
I think there's a learning curve to it. But what Bubble do really well is they've got an extensive academy. They've also got an extensive blog and resources. What's quite cool is they've got a kind of a blog theme where they write tutorials on how to rebuild popular software.
Yeah.
So they've got this series where you build something like Salesforce in Bubble and they show you how to build it.
Mm-hmm.
So on that side of things, they explain the data structure to somebody who may not necessarily have a background in database or information architecture. So that's really cool.
Right.
Yeah, Moshe and I have spoken about this. We both had kind of dabbled in Bubble to a certain extent. And something I really enjoyed was the learning material and the tutorials on how to actually build stuff. So I found that really valuable in Bubble. They had a good inventory of that.
They also have courses and academy that people can join in for price, of course, but we can do some learning over there as well. Now, what you mentioned that you had to do some custom code. What were these things that you have to custom code that Bubble could not support?
So that was very much a JavaScript functionality that I needed to add in. That wasn't something that was built directly into Bubble. So that was more being able to read information from the browser, things like the internet speed, finding the geolocation and using that. So that's where I had to use a bit of JavaScript, and that wasn't directly built in. Bubble does have a great Google Maps integration, so you can embed a map in. You can collect data and create pins on the map. But if you want to do a little bit more, like analyze the traffic patterns, analyze the routes that Google Maps offers in the direction side of things, then you do need that little bit of custom code.
Right, I see what you're saying. What about the front end? Because when I tried Bubble, I did it for validating an idea that I had. So I started with one of their templates. So they have lots of templates, but the templates seems to be more directed to building websites rather than building an actual product. But maybe I didn't use the right template. But when I designed it, I'm not a designer, so I know that my design sucked, and I had lots of issues with menus and scrolling and different things like that. What's your experience with that?
Yeah, I've had the same experiences with Bubble. I found it wasn't quite as intuitive to set things up the way I wanted them to be set up. And what I actually found was that I could get it looking how I wanted it to in the preview. But as soon as I started playing around with screen size and looking at things responsively, it very quickly became muddled. So I definitely found that UI to be a little bit tricky. And it was kind of a case of having too many options in a way, because I kind of dragged and dropped a block into my page. And there were settings to make it fixed width, to make it size to a certain scale, size relative to another object on your page. And there wasn't really that much explanation around how each of those worked. And it didn't quite correlate to what I was seeing on the front end when I actually opened up the user side of the app. And that's kind of where I struggled. But I do think they've made strides in that, especially, we've spoken about the academy and the tutorials they have. They've also released a number of tutorials on how to create a responsive row, how to create a block that scales down. So they've definitely built up that side of the tutorials.
But even other than the technical aspects of that, a good application, a good product needs to have really good designers behind it that design the user experience and design the front end. And I started my career as a developer, and back then we didn't have any designers to work with. We didn't have any product people to work with. We did everything. So that's why software looked like it looked back then, because it looked really bad. I mean, part of it was also the technology that we had and what was available for us. But part of it was because we designed it rather than an actual designer. Yeah. So is that something that you find limiting when using Bubble, or did you use a designer to help you come up with a good design?
So I have a little bit of background in design as well. Traditionally, I was in a similar boat to you, where when I started in web development, I was doing a lot of the design myself. But back in those days, we didn't have things like Figma or Sketch, so it was all done in Photoshop with just layer upon layer. And I actually found that was kind of helpful in using Bubble in a way, because I had that experience of dealing with that high number of layers, which helped me in a way with Bubble, but I still found it quite tricky. But what I actually found that was really, really helpful was an integration between Figma and Bubble. So you could design your layout in Figma and essentially just import it, and it will create all of the page elements and all of the pages as well.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was super cool, and it made it really fast. It's not perfect. I found things like the buttons that were in the Figma design came out without the text, so I would just have like a yellow block as the button without the text on it. But it's really minor stuff to get that to get that looking like you want it to.
Yeah, so possibly you could work with a designer that will come up with the design and then use that integration to bring it into Bubble. What other type of integration they have? You mentioned Google Maps. I remember that they had lots of other things, but did you use any other type of integrations?
So I haven't actually used any of the out-of-the-box integrations besides the Google Maps and the Figma integration. But what I have played around with is using Bubble as a no-code solution, but also as a supplement to a coded solution. So in terms of going the route of creating a big data application, you can very easily use a developer to create something in AWS with a data scientist and create the data input that you would like and the format that you would like, and use Bubble to grab that data from AWS and then use it to actually create the front end of the app.
Okay. Yeah, that was something I was looking into when I was using Bubble from a scalability standpoint, starting with the back end and thinking about the database and how you want it set up. So I was curious I wanted to learn more about, if I'm starting with a foundation of the data architecture, what does Bubble handle, what can it handle, and can I scale this application on third-party AWS or Google Cloud or something like that? So sounds like you did that.
Yeah, sure. So that's exactly what we did in a product that we were trying to pivot the recruitment software into, where we created a vast data source that goes into an AWS DynamoDB, and then using APIs we can just take that data and push it into Bubble and use it in Bubble, and really create the whole front-end software of the front-end experience of the software with Bubble, and then just display the data from AWS.
Okay, that's cool. Because some of the other things I looked at, some of the other tools I looked at when I was looking through these, they have their own database platform that they prefer to use, I think, in some of these cases. And so you're kind of tied to what they support or what they can handle. So the ability to move to other applications is pretty cool. I think that's a real advantage Bubble has.
Yeah, it is great. I mean, I've seen other people in the community as well that use Bubble almost as the front end for a headless CMS. So they would use, they've got an existing kind of data source, whether that's a CRM or a CMS like WordPress. And then they kind of build a middleware software to get that data out of the CRM or out of WordPress or something like that, and then get it into Bubble.
And it sounds like this tool that you built with this recruiting application is that internally facing? One of the things that Moshe and I has discussed is whether these applications are internal facing or they're external facing, where you can monetize them on, say, an Apple store or something like that.
Yeah, the long-term idea was to make this external facing, and to have it monetized, going through a Stripe subscription payment engine. So it started out with a closed beta. We got some good feedback on it, but I think there wasn't really the product market fit we were after. And that's where we've started pivoting the idea a little bit and bringing more big data into it, looking at things like, what are a company's chances of hiring, what are the chances of a candidate leaving their current role, and bringing kind of that data in and becoming more predictive than just receiving applications and analyzing the applicant. So we are in the process of pivoting that idea a little bit, and then relaunching at some point.
Sounds like a really interesting tool. Sounds like you're really addressing a problem in the market. I think that's cool.
Yeah, it was interesting because that feedback came from somebody who was kind of a bridge between being part of the project and also beta testing it. And they kind of said, these would be some cool ideas if it had this functionality. This is what recruiters are really after at the moment. And there's a few solutions out there, but they're either incredibly expensive or they don't fit the need of the recruiter.
I guess transitioning to another question coming off that, you chose to go with Bubble, but did you look at other, we know there's lots of other no-code platforms. Did you look at other ones before choosing Bubble, or was that something you were just comfortable with to start?
So Bubble was the first one that I tried out, and I was actually really comfortable and surprised by it, especially the speed at which you can build logic in Bubble through their workflows. And I kind of just stuck with it. And it was a case of actually me playing around with it and just trying to create, a few parts of the application. And that went so quickly that it kind of snowballed, and I had built a large part of the application quite quickly with Bubble. So I kind of just committed to Bubble.
Well, that's nice. And another thing we thought of is, when we are choosing these platforms to go with, you want to choose one that's going to be around to support your application for the long haul. And I know Bubble is one of the more mature companies when it comes to these no-code platforms. So it sounds like you probably picked a good one to build such a robust application off of.
One thing also to mention is that they only support web application. They don't support mobile applications. So you can do a responsive. So it could be a responsive web for mobile, but they don't support native iOS or Android applications. Oh,
okay.
Right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
There is Thunkable on the market where you can create a mobile application. I think for us that wasn't quite a need, so that's why again Bubble came through as a really viable option for us.
Yeah, and we are planning to talk with a couple of those. Adelo is one of them, and Thunkable that do support those mobile apps. But that's also something important for anyone that chooses a specific no-code platform to see what would actually their need is going to be.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah. What strategy do you want with the application you're building?
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about the product itself? How easy it is to use? Is there a way to describe it even, without seeing a demo?
Yeah, I can describe it. It's a very simple UI. You've got a sidebar with a list of the elements that you can use. Things like from as simple as drawing a square onto your page template to bringing more complex items through, like form fields and buttons, text. So what you're really faced with is almost a blank canvas and a sidebar with a series of elements, and you can just drag and drop elements onto your page to create a layout. Where it gets really powerful though is once you've kind of created that layout, you could click on any specific element that you've brought onto your page, and you can start creating workflows around that. And that's where the logic of your application really comes in. So for example, if you bring just a normal text input field and you bring a password input field and a button onto your page, you can actually click on the button, say create a new workflow, and then you can say when this button is clicked, register a new user, setting their email as the text field and their password as the password field that you've dragged on. So that's kind of high level how it works. It's really, really powerful. The interface is almost similar to something like a draw.io, where you can dragging elements onto a screen that's got a grid onto it, and then you can really build out your pages.
Mm-hmm. And then you can also execute it to see how it works, right?
Yeah, there's a preview button that's sticky to the top right of the page of the editor, and you can always, as you make changes, you can preview them, and that just opens the application in a new window. You can open it with a debugging tool as well, which is really handy. So when you're using the application from the front end through the preview, if the application runs into an error in your logic, it actually shows you what that error is and allows you to really tweak that logic layer of the application very quickly.
Yeah, I do remember that it was quite intuitive, but there were still a few kind of things that were less because of the complexity. So there was a bit of a learning curve. But like you mentioned before, those tutorials were really great to actually help with the different things. For example, the database or the tables, they don't call it the table, they call it something else. If I can't remember what it was, but they do have a name for that, I think. And then you can add your own data entry if you want to, or if you need to, or you can import it from other places if you're using their own database, of course.
Yeah, that's right. So they do have, they just call it the data tab. And you can create your custom data tabs and your tables through that. So that's really quite intuitive. And that is another section that I think is where Bubble excels. But as we spoke about previously, I think that the section that could be better is definitely the styling and the UI section.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we, in our episode where we were talking, Matt and I, about why product managers would want to be interested in no-code applications like that, no-code platforms, we came up with a couple of reasons. One of them is for proof of concepts, prototypes of early stage ideas, to actually go in and build them up without a lot of without a lot of the expense of getting a whole development team to build it up for you. And then the second one was for aspiring product managers that want to build something and they want to get into product, and they have limited resources on building things, and they can use something like that. But from numbers that I've seen in the past, half of the product managers out there are coming without a really technical background, so coming from MBA programs, coming from business perspective, not from development perspective. Do you think Bubble is a good tool for them to learn and use for those needs?
Yeah, I definitely do think so. I think especially from the side of creating a UI and through their knowledge base and the video tutorials, picking up things like the data structures is quite easy. The learning curve is very shallow there. And I think with the amount that's kind of built into Bubble as out of the box functionality, I think it's really easy to, especially for a product manager, to create a product and almost see what the role of a developer in that would be, to see the role of a designer as well in that, to play around with UI and UX. I think it's a really, really valuable tool to do that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So create empathy to your other team members.
Yeah, exactly yes, that.
Absolutely. And what do you think about, we talked a bit about the points that you couldn't really use Bubble for do different things, but what do you think about the line that goes from just a validation of a problem to actually productizing it and have it a product built solely on Bubble?
I think if you are building something kind of like a CRM, that kind of software that you want to productize, I do think that line is a lot more straightforward. I think once you've got an MVP and you've done some user testing, you've got some feedback, to take that into a product, I believe Bubble is great for that as a purely no-code solution. I think if you're doing things a little more complicated or more complex, I think you would need a developer maybe to step in at some point to take the project to completion. But I feel as though it's a solution that could get you to about 85-90% of the way there for most use cases.
Interesting. That's good to know. Any things you really like about Bubble that you didn't mention yet?
Yeah, I think apart from the ones I've mentioned, I think the community is really growing. I think Bubble as a product team are very quick to engage with users of Bubble on various platforms. I've seen them engage with people who are building things, and they engage with those people on platforms like LinkedIn, on social media as well. So I think what I really like is they definitely seem to be engaged with their users as a community. It's quite clear that they build on that as well, especially with the tutorials that came out around how to use the UI and to create the UI, to create responsive applications. That was something that was added after the rest of the tutorials, and that quite clearly came from user feedback. So I really like that about the product.
And then on top of that, maybe what are some things that you wish they might improve about the product?
I think the UI definitely, in terms of creating that page content. There's other no-code solutions that are more for websites, things like Squarespace and Wix. And while they're obviously not as powerful as Bubble, I do think those solutions offer a more intuitive way of getting a layout together. So I think there's things that they could potentially to pull from that. What would be really nice is if you could drag a container onto the page. So you've got a pre-built responsive container, and then you just add in your elements to that. So it almost kind of creates like a section for the left sidebar, and then you can add your elements to that rather than you having to draw the left sidebar manually, and then play around with kind of all of the complications that come with that.
Another question I was going to have is, I know there was some talk about their pricing changing. So that was a recent thing that came up in the community at Bubble.
Yeah.
So I didn't know. I didn't quite follow. I didn't quite look into it all the way. But I mean, from your experience with pricing, I mean, that's, when you're starting to build these, you start off on maybe a free plan, and then build up as you need it. But what was your approach, and how's your feeling about pricing these kind of things for price for value? How much value you get out of it?
Yeah, so actually when I started building with Bubble, that was 2 price changes ago. And the free tier was great. There was a lot of functionality to that free tier. So I started with the free tier. And then as we got closer to a place where we wanted to launch it and test it with actual users, we upgraded to a paid version. But then not long after that, that was probably about 18 months ago, the price change, there was one price change and a bit of reduced functionality on the free tier. And as you said, in the last week, they actually sent out a couple of emails about updates to the pricing, which again, I haven't had a close look at, but
Yeah.
it does seem that the pricing tier, it's gone up a little bit. It seems like compared to the functionality you get. Yeah, so I think with other newer products entering the markets, I think that's something that they're looking at, and trying to add more value, but also remain competitive.
Right. And I think to the point about the pricing, I think there was a pause on that. I think the community may have had something to say about the pricing strategy, and so I think the community on Bubble may have gotten them to pause on that approach. Yeah, that's interesting. That's something when somebody's thinking about building on these things. Again, think about how you're going to scale it. If you're going to do a prototype and build something small, just a proof of concept kind of thing, that's one thing. But if you're actually committed to, I'm going to build this thing for a long-term application, try to think about what you're willing to pay, and that knowing that prices are going to change, and ultimately the tool that you're building this on could change itself. When you are working with their platform, there are going to be some restrictions around the things you have to just work with as they support your application.
Yeah, 100%. And as you mentioned there, what's nice is that they are quite open to feedback from their community. But what you alluded to there of the product changing, that can happen, for the better or for the worse by taking feedback from the community as well.
Yeah, you could get a new enhancement that everyone was looking for, but you could also have something removed that is part of your application, and maybe you were an isolated group that were using that element, and they're no longer going to support it. So definitely things to think about, since you're not building from scratch, just to think about those things as you approach which tool ultimately you want to use. I think that's good to keep in mind.
Yeah, exactly. And I think on that case, a couple of times they've made updates to Bubble while I've been building. And what I will say is there was a little warning that said, there's a new update. Do you want to proceed to update your application to run on this newest version? So that could help in certain cases as well.
For sure. Yeah, and I think that's something else to consider when you're thinking about using one of these is go ahead and hop into a free plan. I know I've looked at several of these no-code platforms, and ultimately you want to use something that you're comfortable using. So from the UI and UX experience of things. So, to your point that you got in a Bubble and you enjoyed it and you got up and running quickly, that's great. And so that's something to think about.
Yeah, and especially for if you're just using it for prototyping or validating your ideas, then I think most of them have a free tier for that, where you don't even have to pay anything to actually host it and have users using it. You might be limited with the number of people that actually can test it for you, or if what stage of validation you want, but that could be an option as well.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it seems especially with Bubble and one or two that I've looked at recently, it's more that you can't put a custom domain to it and you can't do more of the custom functionality. You get kind of the broad range of functionality that you can use to prototype, and you can host it on, a .bubble.io address or something like that you can share the application with.
Right. Rather than just redirect it to your own or IP or whatever it is, or domain.
Oh, so you can host it on the Bubble itself as like if people are looking for applications that serve a purpose, they can go to Bubble itself and find you.
Yeah, I think you'd have to share the URL directly rather than it being something that's publicly found. But yeah, you can share a subdomain on Bubble.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. No, that was very enlightening for us. I hope also for our audience, it will be also interesting to hear about some of the other products in future episodes. Thank you so much, Kishan, for joining us. Is there anything else you would like to add from your experience?
No, I just want to thank you for having me today. I believe these tools are all progressing at quite a rate, and I think there is definitely a place in the future for product managers and even for developers and designers to be able to rapidly create software using these tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that they will, in the future replace every use case. I think there is still a lot of space for developers out there.
Yes.
Yeah.
I always say that you're going to need developers to develop these tools. So, these tools don't make themselves. So at the end of the day, you still need developers to do that.
Yeah. But I definitely think there is more space for product people to start using them. So we hope people will find value in this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kishan, for coming. We really do appreciate it. This is really interesting about Bubble to hear that it's even more robust than I originally thought. So I'm definitely going to look more into it, and appreciate your time today. And thank you, all the listeners. We'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Moshe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.